Good afternoon, everyone. Before we start, I would like to say a few words about the importance of a collective action. In the last 10 years or 8 years, I've been working mostly in collectives. There was always more than one author. And there's one very important thing that I want to say in the very beginning, that exactly 2 years ago, I was standing exactly here, more or less in this position, and showing the church project. In this very room, and it was also, like today, it was a work in progress, as you can see on this ugly stamp. And in this room, I met a lot of people that actually contributed to the collective. This project was developing later. It had 3 authors, it had 30 or 35 contributors of different kinds, and I met 2 people here in this room that actually went inside the book that was created later. It was Aleksandra Kędziorek, who is a researcher of Polish architecture of the Thaw, and it was Maria Dremaite, who gave us an interview about the churches in Lithuania. This book proved to be a success. It was read even by Lech Wałęsa, probably. But the thing is that this place was extremely important for the development of the project, and I want to thank the organizers for doing this and for inviting me again, because it's actually working. Like, you are doing something that's pushing things forward, and it's actually really, really cool. Starting with this, I'm coming back to this work in progress slide. We are showing work that is not finished, that is collective. And if you have any comments, or if you would like to give some input to our project, just feel free to do it.
Okay, let me start. The intriguing cliché about postmodernism architecture exists. People say that actually modernists were good at architecture and bad at urban planning. And in contrary, postmodernists were bad at architecture and good at urban planning. With this presentation, we actually want to interrogate this assumption. These books, are essential positions of postmodernist thinkings. We all know these books, and the reason why we start with the books is actually that there was something called Iron Curtain, and the books, actually the articles and something that was published actually was the reason how the postmodern theory appeared in the Eastern part, or in the Eastern Bloc. Being unable to see the real estates, many architects in the Eastern Bloc were quite familiar with the ideas of postmodernism from the very beginning. And we actually want to concentrate and to focus for a second on the one of the book, and we actually want to start from the beginning, from the Bible. The Bible was written down by Creer brothers in 1976. And as it's coming from the name of this book actually proclaims coming back to the roots and completely rejection of modernism. Yeah, this book actually, we have briefly a couple of these slides from this Bible, and actually this book completely rejecting any structures that was proposed by modernist architecture, and replacing the structure with simple buildings, something that is completely understandable for the users, for the people. And they're even using really simple words to describe all these things. And the one thing that is really, really important here is that actually the visual composition of the city, of this district is extremely important. They're actually coming to a conclusion that the city as it is just composed of 2 elements, with the streets and with the squares. And this project of extension of Washington Grid by Creer brothers actually epistomizes the very philosophy of postmodernism architecture by firstly rejecting modern principles and coming back to the tradition. And secondly, that the urban tissue is much more important than the separate buildings located in this tissue. So we actually come into the conclusion that postmodernism is about urban planning, not architecture.
So I will just give some this was a theory, but as Petro told, the architects had these books. They couldn't see these buildings, but they had this theory and they were following it, especially in Poland, where people were really, really fed up with modernism that was also associated with communism. So you can see, for example, the church of Stanisław Niemczyk. I believe this one was shown yesterday. And you can see in here that this church is the beginning of a very interesting phenomenon, that there is a wall in here, and this church is actually as much an architectural project as an urban project. The architect told me that he was trying to create this kind of extremely cozy space, 19th century space that he remembers from his hometown of Bielsko-Biała, or Cieszyn, which is like a 19th century city, and he wanted to recreate this atmosphere of the 19th century, and this was developing. This is a very interesting church. This is probably the only church in the world which is not an architectural project, it's an urban design. So you can see that there is a collection of squares inside the city block, and a collection of streets, something that is completely rejecting the modern planning and introducing the ideas that were presented in the postmodern books, the church that is actually an urban planning design. But what is more important, because Stanisław Niemczyk he's sort of a star of Polish architecture, like everybody knows him, but what's really more important is the projects that were not made by stars. So, for example, in the city of Wrocław, that I am from and Petro is living right now in, this is like a random image from the generic part of the city, where you can see the 70s. And in the 70s, the architects actually thought that the 19th century buildings, this is something that has to be rejected. It's ugly, it's old, has no value, and the modernity has to come, and it has to be like white and beautiful and geometrical. And there was a huge generation change in 1980 after the Solidarity. Solidarity didn't only bring the protests, it also brought like a generation change in the schools, universities, etc. And actually different things were proposed. So in here you can see these three buildings from the first photo, and in here you can see there was a huge fight how to build the city, and you can see that what is called in Germany the critical reconstruction, and what was introduced in the 80s, it was also introduced in 1980, 1981 in Wrocław, and in Poland there is a lot of these generic parts of the city where the 19th century city was recreated with this kind of new building, something that you can see all over the place that we are at. It's like completely nameless, and there is no star architect behind it. It's just a different principle of urban design that was brought by postmodernism to Western Poland. But what is funny is that these principles, they were brought to different cities. This is Warsaw. This is the central space of Warsaw, probably the most important square in Poland, the Defilade Square or Parade Square. And there's also another project by architect Domosławski, also proposed in the 80s, where he actually also recreates the tradition. He takes this kind of typical urban block of the 19th century that you can see here, and he puts it around the skyscraper, sometimes horizontally, sometimes vertically, actually recreating this material in a completely different way, in a more grotesque way. And what is important is that Warsaw is a different kind of city. Wrocław is a 19th century city that was destroyed by war, and there is like a lot of history you can come back to. There's a lot of tradition you can recreate. Whilst Warsaw was completely destroyed during the war, and it was developed again according to a completely different urban planning tradition, not the 19th century Gründerzeit city or not a European city, but a completely different tradition. And what kind of transition? This is actually a very important graph. You can see here that in the Soviet Union, in Russia, in the Imperial Russia, there was actually not so many people living in the cities during the Bolshevik Revolution. It was 15% of all the people. And the cities, they were actually built afterwards. That means that there is no 19th century that you can actually build on. You cannot recreate it. It was not there. There were just a few cities. There was St. Petersburg, that was Riga, there were some cities in Poland, of course, and in Eastern Europe, but in general, this new tradition was born afterwards, and we are going to describe it.
Yeah, actually this tradition was born at the Palace Square in St. Petersburg. Yeah, actually you probably all know that before Russian Revolution, before 1917, this square was actually the projection of power of Tsar regime, and actually it was completely controlled by military troops. And actually this square was firstly filled up with the people somewhere during the time of Lenin, actually during the time of the revolution, along three main trajectories. The first one is political life. Political life was the kind of a promise of agora. I mean, the square is the place where people, I mean, each of the person could actually proclaim their own ideas and to discuss something. The second one is, of course, the developing of mass media. At this picture, we could actually see people are listening to the radio somewhere in an urban space. And yeah, mass media actually followed to something called Okna Rosta that was actually produced by poet Mayakovsky and the artist Rodchenko. Yeah, and actually this Okna Rosta, they appeared everywhere in the city, mostly, I mean, covering the facades, just like to make the agitation and the propaganda. And actually there was a time when the urban mass theater firstly introduced to the squares, and on this picture we could see actually the storming of the Winter Palace with the 80,000 actors, and actually this storming was like never happened actually. Yeah, a lot of artists actually, the prominent artists of the avant-garde, they were somehow connected with the square as well. So here we can see the project of the decoration by Nathan Altman of the same square. I mean, I was showing before, and I mean, he was not only the one who was trying to, I mean, to engage in this process as well. So yeah, I mean, let's say the square was mostly the decoration for some processes or for the same urban life that appeared there at that time. Yeah, this is also the picture of his. Yeah, on this picture we could see actually, or probably I will show this one first and then here, we can see the result of this, let's say, mix of the theater, architecture, of these political processes, and this is the square, the main square of the city Kharkiv in Ukraine, and yeah, it's actually built up as the stage, and I mean, you could see this. I mean, it's completely theatrical. I mean, not really architectural one, the typology, and yeah, so you can see actually how people were moving here. I mean, on this square. Yeah, and actually you could see that there was the really strong tendency to mix the theater, the action, and I mean everything on the square. And this is the project by architect Melnikov. And I mean this project, and actually a project like this, never appeared because time has changed.
So the paradox of the 20s that Petro was talking about is that although it was the new Bolshevik state, there was actually quite a big amount of different freedoms, like different freedoms of creation for the artists, freedom of going into the squares, and it ended up very quickly around the end of the 20s when Stalin grasped power. So actually the Kharkov Square is the only one that was built in this style, and a completely new agenda started. So very important moment is that in the 30s, Stalin decides to rebuild Moscow to create the capital of the new empire, and rebuilding means destroying a lot of buildings. It means designing with voids. You can see that everything that was inside of these red lines had to be completely erased and create like white boulevards, etc. So this actually means that throughout the whole 30s, all the architects, they were actually designing squares, because voids in the city means squares, streets, avenues. So the whole, let's say, elite of Soviet architecture was really preoccupied with designing the voids. And they made a huge discussion in the press that we all read, the discussion about how to do it. And the important thing is that it was a double rejection. If Krir was rejecting rejecting the modernist city, they were rejecting the capitalist city. And that meant that they were rejecting the Tsarist city. They rejected the capitalism that happened in Russia. and they were rejecting the Western city. They were also rejecting all the ideas from the Western architects. So in the very beginning, like creation of this new socialist space, it was a double rejection of what was known. So for example, we can see in here the plan of Chicago made by the City Beautiful movement, which is like full of ideas how to organize a capitalist city. And you can see, actually I like the slide very much. Oh, it's so blurred for some reason, but anyways, I will tell you what's on it. So on this square you can see this is Chicago in 1909, and this is Leningrad in 1936, and you can see exactly the same buildings, the same elements, the same architectural style, but a completely different principle of designing urban space. In here it's a space of circulation, in here is a space of spectacle. This is a model that we created in our project. It's a model of two types of two ideas or two visions of a life that were created at that point. The most important things, I will not read all of it, but the most important thing is that in the Western city, circulation is a priority. You have to have compact places, a lot of wide sidewalks so that you can enter cafes and enter the stores. You cannot have too much space. If you have a square, there's a lot of things in the middle of it so that you can go around it. Whilst in the East, the spectacle square has a completely different principle. The most important thing is to get the people to the square, to get as many as possible, and to create some sort of course, totalitarian spectacle. So on this image, you can see that there is this kind of difference. This is, I don't know what's going on with the but anyways, so this is the Western idea with a lot of people between the buildings. This is the Eastern idea with the parade and spectacle on the ground and in the sky and a lot of politics, etc., etc. And like the most important thing in this is the capacity. I mean, the square in Warsaw that I was showing, it was designed for 500,000 people, and if you take the streets around for 1 million people, this was like the basic parameter of how they designed it. And what happened is that the new squares, for example, Manezhnaya Square that was created in Moscow in the 30s, look like this. They're like empty black squares that actually are empty for majority of time, but sometimes there is some sort of a spectacle appearing there, and of course this spectacle is state designed. It looks like a military parade in here, or like a very syncretic holiday in here. It's probably the 1st of May or the 9th of May or some other state holiday where like everything goes together. The art, the spectacle, the people, the political activity, the media, all the things that were introduced by Lenin, they go together, of course, within this kind of totalitarian discourse. The lettering, and what is important is it something that I still say about? Yep. Yeah, okay. So what is important, this is actually a very important moment. This is the square in Warsaw, and this is 1956, and these are two events that happen in this time within 3 months. I mean, this is an infrastructure that was designed for the spectacle, but which doesn't have political, I don't know, it's not Stalinist or capitalist or democratic, it's just an infrastructure. So you can see that in here, in 1956, in August, you have a military, in July, you have a military parade, which is like this kind of totalitarian, top-down design with a lot of troops going. And only a few months later, you have a rally, a political rally that summoned around a million people and completely liberalized Poland, and the political thaw started exactly on this square. And then afterwards, a lot of weird things started happening. I mean, this square was designed for totalitarian power, then it was the moment when there was some sort of a democratic movement, and then it actually started living its own life. So there was this kind of weird parades designed by the state. Here in Manezhnaya Square, there are people coming to greet Gagarin, who came back from outer space. In here you have the Cosmic Pavilion, which was the most popular exhibition in Poland in the 70s, etc., etc. So you can say that there's a lot of kind of typical urban life happening, and this kind of huge urban plaza or this huge urban agora becomes some sort of a new meaning.
Yeah, and actually 80s is the time of transformation, and the communism is no longer a dream. The power, I mean, this, like, let's say pro-Soviet powers is no longer centralized, and a lot of agents, I mean, actually independent agents started to appear in the Eastern Bloc. And I mean, we could say, for instance, that it's like independent media, or let's say semi-independent media. For instance, in the case of Poland, it's of course churches that, I mean, started to build. And actually, this transformation in the public sphere is directly reflected in the public space, as we see. And the public square, as the political agora, as was actually declared 60 years before, came to the life in 80s. People were gathering, as you see, with like their own media and with their own position. That was not really governmental one. On this picture, actually, we could see the extreme example of this. It's the Holy Mass held in 1987. Actually in front of the Stalinist skyscraper.
I don't know if you can see it, but because it's blurred, but this is actually people everywhere. It's 1 million people that are gathered on this space everywhere.
Yeah, as we see, actually the art is coming back to the square as well. This is the actionist movement, and they were actually occupying the Red Square in Moscow at the same time. Yeah, and this is actually the protest that was like held in the Soviet capitals, actually in the Yerevan. Yeah, I mean, it was the really huge movement of this protest. And let's back a bit to the theory. This is actually the idea of the true city by Creer brother that were written down this Bible. As I showed before, for them actually the real city or the true city is composed with two elements. The first is public buildings, Respublika, and actually the buildings that earn money, res economica. And we see this diagram a bit differently. So we see this diagram of true city by Creer brother as the call to build up all the empty spaces in the post-communist city. So this is actually how the true post-communist city looks like. Yeah, this is actually the biggest rally that happened in Moscow on Manezhnaya Square in 1991. Short after this protest, the USSR ceased to exist. And short after the USSR ceased to exist, this square actually ceased to exist as well. It was like built up with the shopping center. So actually, res economica won. I mean, and actually Moscow, it's not the one example of this, because something like this happened in Kiev as well. This is the Maidan of Independence in Kiev. But actually, it didn't stop people. It actually didn't stop us to participate or to proclaim the agora there. So I mean, I was there as well, somewhere here. Yeah, and this is actually a huge movement that let's say happening all over the post-Eastern Bloc. We see the city of Tbilisi. We still see the Kiev, and of course something like this happening in Minsk as well.
So to sum up, I would like to come back to Warsaw. This is how the parade square looked like just after the dissolution of communism. So you can see it's actually big trash. It's not an empty space anymore. It's filled with all kinds of trash. It's filled with a lot of activities, and people in Warsaw hate it. Like, people really hate it. Everybody wants to get rid of this. And there has been a lot of ideas what to do with it. This is my favorite one, mostly because of the computer graphics that's being used here deliberately. But all of these ideas, they were all concentrated on one thing, to build it up and not to leave anything. So here we have a collection of ideas that were made by developers, activists, Warsaw municipality, a lot of different people, a lot of different actors, and the only thing that is common for all these examples is their essence. Build it up, not let the big square be there, build it up completely, and all of them talk about creating public space, which is paradoxical. They create public space by killing it, and they talk about the plaza actually by talking about the buildings that will be in its place. And an interesting thing is that these are two examples of what has been happening there, more or less in this space in the last half year. So on the left side, you have an event that was on the parade square around 2 weeks ago. They changed the name of the square into the Square of Women, and there was this kind of feminist movement going on there. And on the other hand, you have the right nationalists that are making a rally in the very same space. So you could say these are actually people who have a completely different opinion, and they are actually like really contrasting one another. But it's not true. They are both doing the same thing. They are using the public space. They are using the space that was designed to be an agora as an agora. And the real contrast is here. I mean, in here you can see this and this is an empty space. Only here it's surrounded by buildings in this kind of postmodern idea, while here it's surrounded by the people who are participating in some sort of a big holiday. So what we are trying to say in this presentation, to sum up entirely, there are two visions of urban space, and one of the, like, what we find extremely important in the urban ideas of postmodernism, that is actually proposing a very certain vision of what the urban space is. And if it works in the cities that used to be capitalist before, that used to have this tradition, that have the urban tissue that you can build it on, it actually works. In Wrocław it works, in Petersburg it works, but in cities like Warsaw, in cities like Kiev, in cities like Moscow, what happens is that returning to tradition actually kills an existing tradition, kills an existing way of using the space. Something that was built as a totalitarian space, but then actually evolved towards a more and more democratic space, and evolved into more and more into what it was designed as, or thought as in the very beginning, into an agora. Yeah, and we want to finish with this example. It's also here in Berlin. There were also ideas to build up Alexanderplatz in the same way. Thank you. 27 minutes.
Thank you, Kuba. Thank you, Petro. Any questions?
Thank you. I just want to ask you, you have shown the first image that this work, this research is a work in progress. What's your vision? Where are you heading to?
We have no microphone anymore.
No microphone. So we believe that this project has many layers. Postmodern transformation is one of the layers. The second layer is media, understanding of media. We have talked about it a little bit in the beginning. We believe that what Lenin does, he actually introduced media into the urban space. So this is the other trajectory that we're researching. Another one is how to, like, it's about political activity. Like what we were showing here on some pictures were revolutions. Which is probably not a desired outcome of what this space should work like, but there is more examples when it's actually becoming some sort of a way where people and the power actually negotiate things. So the last year we had protests in Poland where people actually made this word veto from their iPhones and transmitted it to the presidential palace, and actually made the president put the veto on the bills that he was supposed to veto. So actually people were using this not as a, let's say, a revolutionary ground, but rather some big teleprompter from which you can transmit a message directly to the person that needs to get it. So there's a lot of trajectories, and at the end I hope that we are going to end up with a publication. And I think it's going to happen more or less within 12 months.
Thank you for your thought-provoking talk, and I think it's very interesting to rethink the relationship of the square and yeah, revolution, rebellion, or any public collective action. I think you could also compare or connect it perhaps to more recent rebellious gatherings in the Arab world, for example. So I think that could be.
Where exactly?
In the so-called Arabellion, like the Arab.
Oh yeah.
where also digital social media and so on also played a role. But that's just, I'm not an expert for that, but I just wanted to emphasize how important and like what a global phenomenon that could be. But more specific to your point, I was wondering if you could say more about the idea of the agora. So is that something that you bring to the material, or was it in these discussions from the early Moscow period that you said you looked through, that when they were debating on how to create this voided, do they refer to the agora, or rather, because the other model would be the forum, which came to my mind for the Berlin example, because an empty space in Berlin that is a problem until now and will also be demolished by the new, is of course the so-called Kulturforum, where they will build a museum all over the open public space there. And then I also wondered if you would put the Moscow plan, which is kind of really breaking the tradition of the urban planning of Moscow, but on the other hand, I think it relates to the Osman plan for Paris, like in a very perverted or gigantomaniac way. Would you agree on that, or I don't know?
Okay, one by one. We believe this is an important topic because, like, we understood, this is actually what our text will start with. We understood that we are going from conference to conference, and we are watching at slides with like green public spaces with bikes and happy people on the renders. And then we walk out from the room and there is a TV and there is a protest on the TV, and the people use the public space in a completely different way than the architects designed it. In Moscow it's even more hardcore because this kind of Western fluffy way of seeing public space is used as a means not to let people gather there. We are looking at what's going on around the world, like people protesting on the Brooklyn Bridge because there is no other place in New York that has that capacity, or the Georgians making a techno rave party in front of the Parliament building in order to protest, etc. So we think it's actually important, and we don't propose to make like 1 million people plazas, but we would rather focus in giving some sort of a guidebook how to design some sort of an agora. The second question about the agora, this is this difficult one. Of course, they were talking about the agora. Like they were saying, we are going to, in this text, they were saying, we are going to ignore the last 500 years of urban tradition, and we are coming back to agora and forum and etc. But of course, it was just words, and at the end of the day, it was a totalitarian state after a few years. So it was more talking than actually doing. But then, ironically, this is what actually happened, right? So Lenin, putting these words about this being a freedom space and place for free speech, even if it wasn't, he actually put this kind of time bomb that exploded in the 80s, which I think is cool. The third question was about Moscow.
Political tradition as well, I mean, the political... Yeah, and actually, I mean, just a bit add, I mean, this time bomb by Lenin is actually the something that we called the, let's say, the political gathering culture. I mean, there was not before. I mean, as you know, probably all of the Bolsheviks movement and so on, they were like rather, hiding themselves somewhere in the buildings. So actually in the 1970s, they used really the whole public space, to educate to people together. This is like the small part of this time bomb as well that actually exploded in the 80s.
Yeah, and the last question about Haussmann, I don't think so. I mean, as I understand the Haussmann plan and his work on Paris, it's very much about, he kind of invented the real estate approach to, to rebuilding a city. Let's destroy it, let's build it better, let's make some bigger space, and let's sell it. It's actually the opposite. It's completely different. Also, there's like a lot of really interesting details, because I was trying to read a lot about the Haussmann plan, and there's a lot of interesting details about, for example, how military were saying that Haussmann really was bad at designing military spaces. I mean, there's this myth that this is designed for the military, but the military themselves has said, like, he didn't consult us. It's really, really badly designed. We cannot control the city. So there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of cliches about Haussmann, and we are very specific about showing the city beautiful movement, because I think this is very, this is some sort of a thing that is very well related to postmodern architecture that came after communism. And it also was just before, and it's driven by the same principles of actually designing in order to distribute people equally and to bring circulation into the city.
Thank you. Yep, one last question.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I really liked your analysis of urban space. I don't know if I would always agree with your dichotomies that you're putting. Particularly, you're talking about one historical one. You mention the presentation of the Moscow Plan and of the Stalinist urban space as being a counter-preposition to Western urban planning, to be not related to circulation and so on. And I wonder, I mean, I would say that the influences of different urban ideas from the West, including the ones of Osman and including certain other early 20th century ideas, are pretty obvious. I mean, this is not that the Stalinist planning did not develop without any relations or as a complete difference to the West. So I was wondering, what is your interpretation in the sense, is there such thing as a totalitarian space? Because, I mean, we know the interpretation, for example, of Aldo Rossi, who says, oh, all these Moscow spaces, this is actually a well-functioning mixed-use city, and this is something very positive, and it has nothing to do with totalitarianism. It's just that it happens to be in a totalitarian country, but this is not like that. Up to which point would you actually say that Stalinist urban planning is connected to totalitarianism, promotes totalitarianism, is the forum for a totalitarian regime?
I'm not sure if I will answer this question, because it's very, but it has a lot of threads. But I think that the resemblance of the Stalinist city to the Western city is very superficial. On the superficie, yes. You can see it on this very blurred image. I'm sorry for that. I'm not sure why the images are so blurred. But the architecture of the Stalinist country and in the 30s, for example, Stalinist architecture and American architecture are not very different. They are very much the same. They look very, very different. They are actually grounded in the same principles. They are both extremely conservative and reactive to the avant-garde. But what is different is the urban space. And the basic difference, of course, is property. Like in the communist countries, everything is owned by the state, and the means of production are owned by the state, and the public plazas are owned by the state, and it causes a completely different configuration of elements. So, for example, in here, you can see that there is a constant tension between the private and the public, and there is the line between the private and the public is like in a constant tension. There is like two vectors beating it from the other side, causing the congestion. While in here, everything is public, so you can have more space. You can actually, you can have gesture, you can have more of the empty space. And this is the fundamental difference, I think. The amount of the void is the fundamental difference. If you read any kind of academic paper about the socialist city, I think there's not a single person who would not write that the biggest difference is the amount of greenery and the amount of public space in the socialist city. It's just more of it. As for the totalitarian capacities, we are trying to look at this at infrastructure. This is the space that can be used, and how it is used. This is the question, right? And here, I think this is a very beautiful moment, because in here you have Marshal Rokossovsky, who is designing the parade, and he was designing the parade for half a year, and for half a year the soldiers were training on the military ground on the airport next to Warsaw in order to be perfectly synchronized and go through the city in this kind of totalitarian way. And only 3 months later, the very same infrastructure is used for something completely different. At the moment when there is a revolution and let's say bloodbath in Budapest, at the very same moment there is this kind of let's say non-violent protest or rally who is supporting a more liberal kind of a communist who is promising liberalization of the system and building it anew. Which he eventually didn't, but well, he did in some ways, but then he was pushed away. So you can see that this kind of infrastructure can be used in a completely different way. And what we will be trying to answer in the publication that I hope we are going to write in the next year is what kind of conditions are needed in order for this space to be this kind of peaceful democratic agora.
I have one question that I would keep from this one, in the sense that I would tend to say that Aldo Rossi was right. For instance, the Soviet architecture is quite similar to the architecture in Washington, also the urban spaces, so much so that Donald Trump recently had this big argument about how many people were there in the square and so on and so forth. And the problem of Rossi and his generation was when they tried to design these spaces, these public spaces, these public agoras that are not working because people don't go there. Because somehow since the 70s, the society and culture has been changing. So it is more and more individualized to the point that now we go to a city, we follow Google Maps, we go to our Airbnb and whatever. So I was wondering, how would you manage to give an agenda or a book or a guide to design this space? And also this image you're showing, the people are really discretized. There is no community on the left one. And in a square, it can happen anything, a gay pride, a neo-Nazi manifestation, or anything else. It's a matter of politics, of the government who decides who can, who cannot. And yeah, that would be, how can you manage to give a guideline which is architectural and not political?
This is exactly the question we are fighting with. This is a central thing, right? Because in here, what is the tension here? The tension is here, you have so much space that you will have revolution and you cannot control the city space, or you have so little that you are not able to, like in Moscow, for example, now, that you are not able to gather the people in the moment of a real crisis. Of course, if you have working procedures and you have working institutions, you don't need that much of this political space. But on the other hand, if you don't, you might need some sort of it. So I think that there's a lot of questions that need to be answered about the property, about the size, about the location of this. And this is exactly what we are trying to establish. We are well aware that this is not like something good. This is not something that is like, this is not good space. But this is something that is an alternative. Like now we are being told that there is only one way how to design urban space, which is like Jan Galish kind. Which I believe is really dull and doesn't really make much sense in all of the cases. So we are going to be trying to extract from this, not propose this as a solution, but extract from this what could be the alternative of seeing the public space.